Hello, and welcome back to Checkmate, Atun Shei, the series where I carry on calling out the callousness of a sly snowbird known as Atun Shei. This is part 2 of my long-winded response to Episode 7 of Checkmate Lincolnites. Did the Confederacy have better generals? For this part, we will be looking into the spoiled meat of the video. His thoughts on several generals, on both sides of the conflict, and how well he represents their capabilities as commanders. If he does so at all, that is. I'm ready to stare into the deep, dark abyss that is his takes on these commanders. If you're ready, then let us begin. In the video, Atun Shei discusses 8 generals of the war: Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, George Meade, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Benjamin H. Grierson, Joseph E. Johnston, George H. Thomas, Ulysses S. Grant, and finally, Robert E. Lee. There are a few other commanders he mentions briefly in the video, including George B. McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, John Pope, Benjamin Butler, Nathaniel Banks, and John Bell Hood. He only makes one reference to Jeb Stuart, but leaves out a considerable number of generals on both sides. For the Confederacy, he makes no mention of James Longstreet, A.P. Hill, D.H. Hill, Braxton Bragg, Albert Sidney Johnston, John Magruder, William Mahone, Samuel Garland, George Anderson, Benjamin Huger, George Pickett, and countless others. For the Union, he makes no mention of Joe Hooker, Philip Sheridan, George Armstrong Custer, Emory Upton, John Sedgwick, Samuel Heintzelman, Winfield Scott Hancock, John Fremont, Irvin McDowell, and a host of other generals who served for the Union. Of course, he cannot go through an exhaustive list of generals, but many of the ones I've mentioned, such as Braxton Bragg, George Pickett, Philip Sheridan, and George Armstrong Custer, are all well-known commanders during the war, many of whom earned their recognition during the war. In the end, there's a whole host of famous commanders and often fantastic commanders to study, and I would highly recommend looking into all of these commanders. However, for the sake of this video, we will be looking at the examples Atun Shei covers and see what he has to say about them. First, we will be examining his thoughts on Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. In the video, Atun Shei states the following.
Why don't we break it down? What's so great about all these CSES generals? Go ahead, Johnny, ball's in your court.
I'll start strong, shall I? Thomas J. Jackson. He expelled the Yankees from the Shenandoah Valley in a near-flawless campaign of maneuver and decisively flanked Hooker's 11th Corps at Chancellorsville.
He also froze during the 7 Days battles when his lack of coordination with Lee and Longstreet caused horrifying numbers of unnecessary Confederate casualties. Look, I like Jackson, but I think his death was probably the best thing that could have happened to his reputation. He would have fallen from grace eventually. It was inevitable. I mean, could you imagine him fighting in the defensive grind of the Overland Campaign or the grueling trench warfare of Petersburg? His brilliance as an aggressive general was unmatched, but in many ways he was kind of a one-trick pony. And I think a compelling argument could be made that Jackson's offensive tactics ultimately did more harm than good.
I see Atun Shei mentioned a campaign I'm very familiar with. So let me just go ahead and refer to this source I've used a few times before. You see, to put the 7 Days battles into its proper context, from the perspective of Thomas J. Jackson, the counteroffensive launched by Robert E. Lee took place on June 26, 1862, with the opening engagement at the Battle of Mechanicsville, also known as the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek. The Battle of Port Republic, the decisive Battle of the Valley Campaign, took place on June 8, 1862, after Jackson had been campaigning in the Shenandoah Valley for nearly 3 months straight. After he finished his campaign, he and his men then had to march over 100 miles from the valley towards Hanover County to link up with the Army of Northern Virginia. During this time, Jackson had received little to no sleep. On page 34 of Extraordinary Circumstances, the 7 Days Battles. Meanwhile, Stonewall left his troops that night for a meeting with Lee on June 23rd. He might have left earlier on the 22nd, giving himself a chance to get some rest as well, but it is not likely that he realized he would need that rest, and any absence during the day would have been noticed and commented on by his men. Mrs. Harris, with whom Jackson was staying, asked Stonewall to eat breakfast with her the morning of the 23rd. Jackson thanked her and said that if he were able, he would. When morning came, Mrs. Harris sent word to Jackson's room. The only person there was Jackson's servant, Jim, who said, "Lor, you surely didn't 'spect to find General here at this hour, did you? You don't know him, then. Why, he left here at 1 o'clock this morning, and I expect he's whipping the Yankees in the valley again by now." Jackson had left early to meet with Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, A.P. Hill, and D.H. Hill at Lee's headquarters at the Dabbs House, which, from Jackson's starting location in Louisa County, was 30 miles away. Starting on June 17th, some of Jackson's forces had marched over 80 miles in 4 days, while others had made it only 60 miles in the same amount of time, this being the Stonewall Brigade holding up the rear. By the time Jackson's forces arrived in Ashland, they were about as thoroughly exhausted as their commander, who, over the subsequent days, had gone with virtually no sleep. Even then, Jackson's forces participated during the Battle of Gaines' Mill, taking up the Confederate left and driving back the 5th Corps, and capturing several batteries on the Federal right, including coffee mill guns used by elements of the 5th Corps. The main criticism leveled against Jackson comes from his actions on June 30th, 1862, during the Battle of Glendale. During this battle, Jackson's forces were advancing up White Oak Road before they were stopped in the hollow where White Oak Creek was located, a creek that had a large swamp basin flanking both sides with bluffs on either side. The bridge had been burned by Federal troops during their retreat with Federal artillery on the bluff opposite the crossing. Jackson had probed the defenses and tried to have engineers repair the bridge, but the constant artillery fire prevented much else. There were also a couple of fords crossing the creek, though Jackson likely was given the impression they were difficult based on dispatch reports by the 2nd Virginia Cavalry. However, what's most significant to consider here is Jackson's actions during the afternoon and evening of the 30th. On page 259, Burton says the following. Stonewall was sitting on a fallen pine tree next to the White Oak Road. Hampton sat next to him and told him that the bridge was finished and the Northerners were still there and exposed to flank attack. Jackson listened with his eyes closed and his cap drawn over his eyes. When Hampton finished, Jackson sat in silence for some time, then rose and walked off in silence. Stonewall did little else the rest of the day. Major J.W. Fairfax of Longstreet's staff came over from the Glendale area to ask for reinforcements. Jackson presumably told Fairfax that he was stymied. At some point during the day, he wrote his wife, implying that he was tired, but pressing her to give at least 10% of their income to the church. Later in the afternoon, he fell into a sleep so sound that nothing would arouse him. He awoke in time for supper, but fell asleep with food between his teeth. Finally, after supper, he looked at his staff and said, "Now, gentlemen, let us at once to bed, and rise with the dawn, and see if tomorrow we cannot do something." Jackson was likely so exhausted that he was making critical errors in judgment during the Battle of White Oak Swamp. It also explains why, afterwards, Lee never punished Jackson for his actions during the 7 days' battles. Jackson was simply exhausted from constant campaigning over the course of 4 months, starting back in March of that year. He was simply tapped out of energy to fight correctly. This, in no way, means Jackson is a terrible commander, but makes Jackson a human being. Thomas J. Jackson, just like anyone else, can be exhausted to the point of falling asleep, even during an artillery duel. This, of course, is rather ironic for Atun Shei to find issue with. One of the arguments of his other videos was his desire to see Jackson portrayed as a human being. Yet, the moment that Jackson acts like any person would when pushed to their limits, he's suddenly a bad general. In truth, Jackson was a fantastic commander who conducted himself fantastically in most of the campaigns he fought in. Using the 7 Days Battles, where Jackson was basically on the verge of collapsing from exhaustion, to smear his legacy is disingenuous. Yet, Atun Shei doesn't leave it simply with this. He goes on to say the following concerning Chancellorsville.
Take Chancellorsville, for example. Sure, he won a flashy tactical victory that fills the pants of military history nerds with buckets of jizz, but what did he actually accomplish, in the grand scheme of things?
He smashed the 11th Corps of the Union Army.
Okay, and?
And
he got a lot of his own troops killed, troops that Lee could not afford to lose. Time and again, throughout the war, rebel generals tried to one-shot Union armies with dramatic Jacksonian offenses. Sure, they might maul a corps and gain a victory, but the Yankees always came back. They never realized that gambling everything on one climactic, decisive, war-winning battle was just a plain bad bet, and it always cost the Rebs more than they gained.
This is an odd argument that Atun Shei insists on using not once, but at least twice in the video, which we will be discussing later on. The issue with this assertion is it ignores the aftermath of the battle. Though Jackson was mortally wounded during the battle, it did succeed in mauling the 11th Corps so badly that it would underperform heavily during the Battle of Gettysburg, which saw the 11th Corps disbanded, rendered non-existent. However, more crucially, Lee managed to force Joe Hooker to withdraw from his planned offensive on Richmond, opening up a window for Lee to conduct his own offensive towards the north. It also led to another shakeup in the Army of the Potomac, as Hooker's competency was questioned, prompting his replacement. Most important of all, Lee managed to do this with Jackson's corps and 2 divisions of Longstreet's corps, the majority of whom were detached down in southeastern Virginia. This is why it's lauded as the perfect battle. Not only did Lee divide his small army, but he managed to inflict considerable damage upon a far larger army with a much smaller force, forcing them to withdraw and, once again, seizing the initiative away from the Army of the Potomac. This is where one of the critical issues with Atun Shei's analysis of these commanders comes into play. He consistently ignores the importance of the initiative. Jackson, as well as Lee, understood the importance of the initiative as a critical factor in warfare. Holding the initiative is not simply a tactical point, but a strategic point. When the South held the initiative, it placed less strain upon Richmond and the surrounding area, which was vital if Lee wished to secure his base of operations and continue to wage the war. By forcing the Army of the Potomac to be on the back foot tactically, it would serve the wider strategic and logistical aim of securing his supply chains and enabling him to carry the war away from Virginia and towards the north. This is why Chancellorsville is significant. As I stated in Part 1, tactics, strategy, and logistics influence one another. However, Atun Shei does not understand this, or chooses to ignore it, as acknowledging the importance of a major tactical victory achieving a vital strategic aim for the Confederacy would run counter to his fallacious argument. From this point, Johnny Rep deflects from the point concerning Jackson, mentioning a number of other generals, specifically Ambrose Burnside, John Pope, Benjamin Butler, Nathaniel Banks, and George Meade. Now, this is one of those rare moments in Checkmate Lincolnites where I have to agree with Atun Shei. Meade was not at all a bad general. He had proven himself to be an effective corps commander and did a good job as commander of the Army of the Potomac. His main issue, one that William Marvel mentioned in The Horrid Pit, was his temper. For instance, in the lead-up to the Battle of the Crater, Meade had received a letter from Ambrose Burnside, who was fairly honest and level-headed as a commander, to be an insult, retorting with an insulting letter of his own. It was his general irritability that was Meade's main flaw as a commander. He let his anger get the best of him. In fact, one of the common issues with the Army of the Potomac throughout the war was its infighting. Many of the commanders had a chip on their shoulder for various reasons, often resulting in fairly petty feuds between them. Meade often added to this due to his temper inciting feuds, particularly with Ambrose Burnside. Speaking of Burnside, I would be reluctant to add Burnside to the list of bad generals, as Burnside did perform well as 9th Corps commander during the Overland Campaign and the Second Battle of Petersburg. His main failing was as an army commander, a position, I would argue, he was not able to serve as effectively as his later successor, George Meade. He was certainly not to the same level of incompetency as John Pope, Benjamin Burgermeister Butler, or, worst of all, Nathaniel Banks, with his personal failings during the Valley Campaign of 1862 and the Red River Campaign of 1864, where he nearly lost an entire fleet of Union ironclads. After his brief aside discussing Meade, he goes on to mention one of the most famous and controversial cavalry commanders of the war, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, for this section, I'm going to be showing all of you the whole section. I want for all of you to tell me what specifically is wrong with this section. I'll catch all of you when he's finished.
I propose we shift our focus to the Western Theater.
Woof. You sure you want to do that, Johnny?
I do. Prepare to quake in your boots, Billy Yank, and allow me to present the most daring cavalry commander of the war. You know him. You love him. It's Nathan Bedford Forrest! Woo! 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 Woo!
Nathan Bedford Forrest, right. Slave trader, Klan leader.
Repentant Klan leader.
Oh, well, that's okay then.
The South's greatest cavalry officer was indeed appointed first leader of the KKK. He tried his best to keep it an honorable organization. Robert E. Lee had been offered the job first, but feeling that it would violate his parole and feeling that a younger man was needed, suggested Forrest.
The Klan was never an honorable organization. It was founded explicitly to terrorize black people and deprive them of their rights as American citizens. Now, Forrest worked hard to keep his association with the Klan secret, but it's not all that hard to piece everything together. In 1871, he was actually called to testify before Congress as part of an investigation into the Klan's terroristic activities. Here's what he had to say when Vermont Congressman Luke P. Poland asked him point blank if he was part of the Invisible Empire.
Are you a member of the Ku Klux, General? I'm not, but I am in sympathy and will cooperate with them. I know they are charged with many crimes that they are not guilty of. What do you think of Negro suffrage? I am opposed to it under any and all circumstances, and in our convention urged our party not to commit themselves at all upon the subject. If the Negroes vote to enfranchise us, I do not think I would favor their disfranchisement. We will stand by those who help us, and I want you to understand distinctly that I am not an enemy to the Negro. We want him here among us. He is the only laboring class we have, and more than that, I would sooner trust him than the white scalawag or carpetbagger. When I entered the army, I took 47 Negroes into the army with me, and 45 of them were surrendered with me. I said to them at the start, this fight is against slavery. If we lose it, you will be made free. If we whip the fight, you stay with me and be good boys, I will set you free. In either case, you will be free. These boys stayed with me, drove my teams, and better Confederates did not live.
Black Confederates! Black Confederates!
They were Teamsters. Don't get excited. Come on, we've been over this.
Do you think the Ku Klux will try to intimidate the Negroes at the election? I do not think they will.
However, a black man named Andrew J. Flowers from Chattanooga also testified at the hearing, and he painted a very different picture of the Klan's activities in Tennessee.
Do you now hold some office?
Yes, sir. I am a justice of the peace.
When were you chosen Justice of the Peace?
I was elected on the 4th of late August.
Justices of the Peace in Tennessee elected by a vote of the people?
Yes, sir. I was elected by a vote of the people.
I want to inquire of you, particularly in reference to some violence, which it has been understood was committed upon you a short time ago. Tell us the story in reference to that.
On the 18th, between 11 and 12, or 10 and 11 o'clock, I cannot say exactly which, I woke up and there was a crowd of men, all with masks around me, with pistols in their hands. They waked me up. They called me by my name. They took me out near a mile from the house.
Tell all that they said.
They asked me what was my name. I told them. And some of them said, "Oh yes, you are the man we are looking for," and so forth. One of them told me they were going to kill me. He had a pistol in his hand. After they got me outdoors, the captain of the organization, they called him Captain, told me that he was going to whip me. Said he would give me 25 lashes. That I had the impudence to run against a white man for office and beat him. That they were not going to allow it. That it was an organization organized by them to stop Negroes holding office. And if they did not get out of office by being told or notified or whipped, they were going to kill them. They took me up about a mile from the house and hit me as many as 25 times.
Did they take you into a woods or a swamp?
They took me through the woods into an old field, down near a swamp. I had never been there before. They took off my coat and whipped me with hickories 7 or 8 feet long. They said they were going to give me 25 lashes, and I guess they gave it to me. They told me that if I would promise to resign my office when I went to Chattanooga next morning, they would turn me loose. And I very readily promised it.
They required you to promise to resign your office.
Yes, sir.
Flowers went on to describe how the Klan was using intimidation and violence to keep black men from voting, along with many other acts of domestic terrorism that Nathan Bedford Forrest not only aided and abetted, but more than likely orchestrated.
Oh, you are dastardly Billy Yankin besmirching General Forrest, so you know as well as I that in 1875 he gave a speech to a black civics organization in Memphis in which he said,
"We have but one flag, one country. Let us stand together. We may differ in color, but not in sentiment. Many things have been said about me which are wrong, and which white and black persons here who stood by me through the war can contradict. Go to work, be industrious, live honestly, and act truly, and when you are oppressed, I'll come to your relief."
The speech went over stupendously, and as the crowd erupted in acclamation, one African-American woman gave the old general a bouquet of roses and a peck on the cheek.
Yeah, he said that toward the end of Reconstruction, after the Klan's goal of reestablishing the antebellum social order had been accomplished. Southern Democrats were back in power at that point, and Forrest could afford to be magnanimous. I think his message here, though presented in a very nice and friendly way, was work hard, stay in your lane, and we won't have a problem. Now, I'll grant you this, man. It is also entirely possible that Forrest did have a genuine change of heart. I'm not discounting that. A lot of people at the time thought so. In fact, when a lot of Forrest's former comrades in gray heard about this speech, they shit a brick. One Confederate veterans group went so far as to publish this in their local paper.
"We endorse no action unworthy of a Southern gentleman. I speak of the address delivered before a black and tan audience by General Nathan Bedford Forrest. With what a glow of enthusiasm and thrill of pride have I not perused the campaigns of General Forrest's cavalry, their heroic deeds, their sufferings, and their successes under the leadership of one whom I always considered, in my poor judgment, second only to our immortal Hampton. And now, to mar all the luster attached to his name, his brain is turned by the civilities of a mulatto wench who presented him with a bouquet of roses. What can his object be? Ah, General Forrest."
Well, Billy, I won't lie to you. That's really quite vile. Can we go back to talking about military history now? I found it to be much more comfortable and safe.
One more point. Listen, Forrest is unbelievably overhyped, but he was a competent general. He was also a mass-murdering terrorist piece of shit and should be remembered as such. In my opinion, just about every positive mention of his generalship should be accompanied by extreme moral condemnation, an acknowledgement of the U.S. colored troops he massacred without quarter at Fort Pillow.
But can't we celebrate his military achievements without glorifying his less savory attributes?
Yeah, and we could also celebrate Osama bin Laden's dexterous use of Expedia.com, but that'd be pretty fucking weird, wouldn't it?
Did you notice the issue yet? In a video meant to specifically talk about the military capabilities of the generals who fought during the war, Atun Shei spends most of the time discussing Forrest's alleged involvement in the Klan rather than, discussing Forrest's military career and capabilities as a general. With this, I wish to address some of the claims made concerning Forrest's alleged involvement in the Klan before we get into the reason why he deflects to his favorite style of red herring. The main source behind most of this stems from, of all things, 2 blog posts by Andy Hall. Andy Hall tries to make the suggestion that Forrest was in the Klan by inferring it from sources written many decades after Forrest's death, meaning that Forrest could not speak for himself whether these allegations were true or not. In fact, one of the sources heavily used by Andy Hall comes from Laura Martin Rose, a lady who was paramount in spreading propaganda about the nature of the Klan and its history. This, of course, means that taking anything stated in there at face value is foolish due to the simple fact that much of it could very well be made up. After all, when Laura Martin Rose was writing these books, she was doing so during the birth of the Second Ku Klux Klan, a Klan wholly distinct from its original namesake. The main claim behind Forrest being in the Klan comes from the book The Ku Klux Klan, or Invisible Empire. It refers to a letter allegedly written by James R. Crow, one of the founders of the Klan, claiming that Forrest was chosen to be their Grand Wizard. The problem is the letter dates to 1908, many decades after Forrest's death. There's also the afterward note stating that the author of the book in question is in possession of these letters and affirms they, and I quote, contain the truth of history, and nothing could prove more interesting or more valuable in order to preserve the fact for future generations that these records from the pens of the last 2 surviving chapter members of that mysterious brotherhood of men known as the Ku Klux Klan. I don't know about you, but I'd be wary about taking the author's word as absolute fact unless if the letters can be made public. However, what compounds this further is the fact James R. Crow died in 1911 when the book was still being written. This could facilitate any fabrication of any letters, as the original author of said letters would be conveniently out of the way. The main problem with Andy Hall and Atun Shei using this type of source is they have to take a known propaganda pamphlet as absolute fact. In the end, we can never know for certain, as even to Miss Rose's admission, most of the history regarding to the Klan is orally transferred. Nothing was written down, meaning that the truth could just as easily be shifted or, worse, constructed whole cloth in order to trump up the idea of this glorious and noble image that, in reality, was simply a lie. Does this mean Forrest could have been in the Klan? Possibly, but we will never know. With this point out of the way, we arrive back to the main question at hand. Why did Atun Shei spend so much time rambling about Nathan Bedford Forrest's alleged involvement in the Klan rather than talk about his capabilities as commander? Well, simply put, Nathan Bedford Forrest was, without a shadow of a doubt, the best Confederate cavalry commander of the American Civil War. Forrest started the war as a private, but decided to raise his own unit of cavalry at his own expense. He notably fought at Fort Donelson, where he managed to slip away from the fort before its surrender, the Battle of Shiloh, the Vicksburg Campaign, and Chickamauga. During this period, he became well known for his raids, which acted as a significant thorn to the side of Grant during the Vicksburg Campaign. However, Forrest's fame would increase to stardom during the spring and summer of 1864 when, first, he successfully defeated the Union garrison at Fort Pillow, leading to one of the most controversial events of the war. According to Union accounts of the time, Forrest had ordered the men of the garrison to be massacred, though this particular point of contention has turned out to be incorrect. Forrest was likely unaware of the events that transpired in the fort, and the acts of terror committed by his men were likely taken up by individual action. Several months later, Forrest would achieve one of his greatest victories during the war at an intersection of several roadways known as Bryce's Crossroads. Sherman, who had grown wary of Forrest's many exploits, decided to send Brigadier General Samuel Sturgis with a force composed of 8,500 men, including 2 regiments of United States colored troops, to bring an end to Forrest's cavalry. Forrest, who had 3,500 men, was outnumbered well over 2-1. However, at Bryce's Crossroads, Forrest was able to attack both flanks of Sturgis's forces, while the 2nd Tennessee Cavalry, in a flanking march, captured the bridge over Tishomingo Creek, spurring Sturgis's forces to retreat. Forrest, however, kept up the pursuit, forcing Sturgis's forces to continue their flight all the way to Memphis, Tennessee. In the end, Sturgis's forces suffered 2,610 casualties compared to Forrest's 495 casualties, a casualty disparity of over 5-1. The victory opened up the door for Forrest to conduct more raids against the Army of the Tennessee's supply lines, threatening the railway lines feeding the army. It was on June 15, 1864, only 5 days after Forrest's stunning victory at Bryce's Crossroads, that William Tecumseh Sherman wrote the following dispatch to Secretary of War Stanton. "I will have the matter of Sturgis critically examined, and, if he be at fault, he shall have no mercy at my hands. I cannot but believe he had troops enough. I know I would have been willing to attempt the same task with that force, but Forrest is the very devil, and I think he has got some of our troops under cover. I have 2 officers at Memphis that will fight all the time, A.J. Smith and Moore. The latter is a young brigadier of fine promise, and I commend him to your notice. I will order them to make up a force and go out and follow Forrest to the death, if it costs 10,000 lives and breaks the treasury. There never will be peace in Tennessee till Forrest is dead." Forrest served as one of Sherman's most imposing threats during the war. Unlike with Braxton Bragg or Joe Johnston, who faced him in the front, Forrest was an ever-present threat to Sherman's rear, a threat that seemingly would never go away and couldn't be defeated without great expenditure of manpower and material. Forrest's many victories weren't just for show, but showed vital strategic importance during the war. The more Forrest could raid and disrupt the supply lines of the Army of the Tennessee, the more men and material would be required to simply defend those supply lines rather than be stationed at the front, facing off against the Army of Tennessee. For Sherman, Forrest was an ever-present nightmare he would be forced to contend with throughout the war.
Here's Johnny!
It's no wonder, then, that Atun Shei completely glossed over Forrest's military career. To acknowledge Forrest's military prowess as commander, his capabilities of tactically and strategically altering the war by forcing Sherman to burn resources on countering Forrest rather than fighting against Johnston, would be to acknowledge that the Confederacy had highly capable commanders who had the big picture in mind. This would completely undermine the narrative he is clumsily crafting throughout the video. More specifically, it exists to prop up the next commander Atun Shei refers to, which is an odd one, to say the least. Atun Shei decides to talk about General Benjamin H. Grierson, a general that I hadn't even heard of up until I watched this video. According to Atun Shei, Grierson is his favorite Union cavalry commander of the war, which leads me to wonder, why exactly is Grierson his favorite cavalry commander? Well, Atun Shei explains why. He goes on to state the following about Grierson.
Colonel Benjamin H. Grierson, who led a ridiculously clever cavalry raid down the length of Mississippi during the Vicksburg campaign. Though the initial purpose of the raid was to cut the railroad east of Jackson, Mississippi, Grierson went above and beyond the call of duty, going from LaGrange, Tennessee to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, wreaking havoc all the while. Grierson and his troopers broke up 2 other railroads, destroyed weapons and commissary stores, burned storehouses, disabled trains, and freed slaves. All in all, they inflicted millions of dollars worth of property damage on Mississippi and permanently crippled that state's military usefulness for the rest of the war. They also diverted substantial numbers of Confederate cavalry that were badly needed in the defense of Vicksburg itself. But possibly most impressive of all, Grierson accomplished all of this at the cost of 3 men killed and 7 wounded. Contrast that with Forrest's raids. Sure, they were flashy and daring, but did they make a huge difference to the outcome of those campaigns? I wouldn't say so.
So, Grierson was good because he burned a bunch of stuff? Well, if we look at what he did outside of the Vicksburg campaign, he was at the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads when his cavalry contingent suffered heavy casualties to Forrest's cavalry. He would face Forrest again during the Battle of Tupelo, where Forrest's forces suffered heavy casualties, though it's worth noting that Forrest was under the command of Stephen Lee during the battle, and the Federals had the numbers advantage. Then there was his raid in late 1864, early 1865, against the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, which saw moderate success. Most of these actions were decent for a cavalry commander, but certainly nothing to write home about. This is made all the more poignant when we consider his cavalry raid during the Vicksburg campaign was conducted when he was largely unopposed. Pemberton's forces in Vicksburg had no cavalry of their own, including Forrest's cavalry contingent, which was operating in eastern Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia during the time as it was under Joe Johnston's command. Was it strategically effective? Yes. Was it a masterstroke move or a true show of his generalship? Not exactly, no. Just as I don't view Sherman's March to the Sea as a brilliant campaign, I wouldn't consider Grierson's raid to be as significant as Atun Shei makes it out to be. After all, it's easy to march through enemy territory when there's no way for the enemy to stop you. To this point, I'd like to refer to a far more significant cavalry maneuver that took place in the Virginian theater, which, arguably, was better conducted and proved the capabilities of the commander quite handily. On June 11th, 1862, Robert E. Lee allowed for James Ewell Brown Stuart, better known as Jeb Stuart, to conduct a reconnaissance operation of the Army of the Potomac's positions north of the Chickahominy River in order to determine the strength of the enemy forces in the area. At 2 a.m. on June 12, 1862, Jeb Stuart gathered some 1,500 men, including Rooney Lee, Robert E. Lee's son, and Fitzhugh Lee, Robert E. Lee's nephew, for his ambitious reconnaissance operation. On the 12th, Stuart and his party rode northward, stopping roughly 5 miles north of Ashland before turning to the east. On the 13th, they would continue to ride eastward, confronting a number of small pickets, but no major forces. This showed that the forces north of the Chickahominy were weak. Left with the choice to turn around or continue onward, Stuart opted to continue his eastward course. After crossing Totopotomoy Creek, Stuart's men encountered another picket post. During this encounter, one member of Stuart's party, Captain William Latane, was killed, the only man killed during the mission. Moving to the southeast, he quickly stormed Tunstall Station, where they raided the supply depot, attempted, and failed, to stop a passing train, and then burned many of the supplies there. Stuart then sent a contingent of his cavalry a mile to the north towards Garlick's Landing, burning more supplies there. From there, he rode to the south, avoiding a contingent of Union cavalry led by his father-in-law, General Philip Cooke. On the morning of the 14th, Stuart and his men approached Forge Bridge, which had been burned down during Joe Johnston's withdrawal in May 1862. In an example of resourcefulness, his men demolished a barn and rebuilt the bridge, which they managed to cross and burn before a patrol of Union cavalry approached to their rear. By the 15th of June, Jeb Stuart and his men had returned back to Richmond, having completely circumnavigated the Army of the Potomac, bringing back vital information for Lee, disrupting the supply lines for a time, and returning with all but one man. This raid is, arguably, more impressive than that of Grierson's raid during the Vicksburg campaign. This doesn't even get into Union cavalry generals, such as Philip Sheridan and George Armstrong Custer, who were just as good, if not better, than Grierson. Philip Sheridan's actions in the Shenandoah Valley comes to mind. After the previous failures of Nathaniel Banks in 1862 and Franz Sigel in May 1864, Philip Sheridan would assume command of a force in the valley to deal with Jubal Early's forces. During the Valley Campaign of 1864, he not only conducted raids into the valley, he was able to defeat Jubal Early's forces at the Third Battle of Winchester and at Cedar Creek. George Armstrong Custer would also prove himself during the war, first fighting at First Manassas, escaping a trap at Trevilian Station, and fighting Stuart's cavalry at Yellow Tavern, where Stuart would be mortally wounded. He would also fight during the Valley Campaign, being responsible for the sweeping victory at the Battle of Waynesboro, which saw the destruction of Early's cavalry. So, why would Atun Shei choose Grierson? My guess is due to Grierson's actions during the Vicksburg campaign. Grierson's raid in eastern Mississippi in 1863 was similar to Sherman's actions during the March to the Sea, raiding and destroying everything they could access. He destroyed as much of the infrastructure as possible during the raid, which was made easy when you consider the lack of any forces to prevent this. I consider this to be as impressive and noteworthy as raiders burning a village down. It's not a test of military prowess, let alone a sign of military genius. After discussing why he likes Grierson, Atun Shei then moves on to discuss the most strategically minded general of the Confederacy. For this, I'll let Atun Shei do the talking, and let him explain why he has made the choice he has.
And to my mind, I think you guys only had one strategically minded general who thought of things in terms of the big picture rather than individual maneuvers and battles. And he was, of course, Joseph E. Johnston.
Wait, who?
Joseph E. Johnston. I think he was the only senior Confederate general who understood that when you're fighting with limited manpower, you need to pick your battles, literally, very, very carefully. Most other rebel generals thought of war in terms of attacking or defending dots on a map. They were very geographic in the way they went about it, but Johnston understood that when you're outnumbered and outgunned, stubbornly holding on to bits of dirt can often be counterproductive. Maneuver, even strategic retreat, can be much more beneficial in the long run.
There is no way to fight with honor.
Yeah, that's what Jeff Davis often said, which is exactly why Johnston hated him so much and privately talked all sorts of shit about Jackson and Lee. Whereas, it must be said, our side was full of keenly strategic military minds.
For those who are ignorant of the situation regarding Johnston, this sounds like a believable notion. However, much like with many things Atun Shei mentions, there's a lot more going on under the hood than what first meets the eye. In this case, what's under the hood is the equivalent of an engine overheating and about ready to explode. Joseph E. Johnston seems like a capable commander, but the truth is Johnston nearly lost the war for the Confederacy back in 1862. To explain why, we'll be looking into some additional books. to the Gates of Richmond by Stephen Sears, and Lee by Douglas Southall Freeman, the abridged version with the foreword by James M. McPherson. First, we'll be looking into what Douglas Southall Freeman had to say about Johnston. For some background, in May 1862, Johnston had retreated up the peninsula from his initial location nearby Yorktown all the way back to the Gates of Richmond. On page 179, Douglas Southall Freeman says, "Close as Johnston was to Richmond, he had shown no intention of giving battle, and had not informed the President when he intended doing so. Soon after he crossed the Chickahominy, Davis and Lee rode out to his headquarters in order that the President might be apprised of the situation. It was not a satisfactory conference. Johnston was reticent and seemed to have no definite plan. Subsequently, Lee asked Johnston to come to Richmond to review the situation with the President, but Johnston did not answer. At length, probably on May 24th, Johnston came into Richmond and doubtless had an interview with Davis, but apparently he did not explain his plan. The same day, the enemy occupied Mechanicsville. Everything indicated the loss of Northern Virginia and the early junction of the two federal forces immediately in front of Richmond, with a strength not much below 150,000. To oppose them, Johnston would not have more than 72,000. Only one of three things could save Richmond: a miracle, a successful attack by Johnston, or the failure of McDowell to advance. Impatient at Johnston's failure to make any movement or to confide his plan, despite their recent interview, Davis expressed to Lee his deep dissatisfaction. The President's concern was so manifest that Lee once more volunteered to act as a peacemaker. "General Johnston," he said to Davis, "should of course advise you of what he expects or proposes to do. Let me go and see him, and defer this discussion until I return." Riding out to Johnston's headquarters, Lee must have had a more satisfactory interview with Johnston than on his previous visit, in the company of the President. For he brought back news that Johnston intended on the 29th to attack that part of the Federal Army north of the Chickahominy. At last, the prospect of an offensive against McClellan. This specific behavior being highlighted here is rather troubling. Johnston refusing to furnish President Jefferson Davis with the information of his plan of attack does not lend well with military command, especially when the Army of the Potomac is within 9 miles of the gates of Richmond. Ensuring that the Commander-in-Chief of the nation knows what is going to be done to reverse the recent fortunes is important with maintaining a smooth military structure. Even after Lee coaxed Johnston to reveal what his plans were, Johnston would go on to find a new and interesting way to bungle up the execution of the military operation he planned. To shift towards Stephen Sears' book, he goes into detail about the overall plan Joe Johnston had concocted to break through and destroy a section of the Army of the Potomac, specifically at a crossroads known locally as 7 Pines. I've made a video about this battle in particular, which, if you're interested in an overview of the battle and the men who fought there, I'd highly recommend. For now, I'll briefly describe Joe Johnston's plan. First, General James Longstreet was placed in tactical command of the operation and would be advancing up 9 Mile Road, an attack from the northern flank. General D.H. Hill would advance up Williamsburg Road, striking at the center, and Benjamin Huger would assault from the south via the Charles City Road. This sounds straightforward on the face of it. However, according to Sears, this was not as straightforward as it sounds, which was only made worse by Johnston himself. On page 120, Sears states the following: "The apparent simplicity of Johnston's plan was deceptive, for it involved one of the most difficult tasks of military command in that day: coordinating several separate columns advancing to battle at the same time, but out of sight of one another. Joe Johnston was not a general noted for his attention to detail, and Seven Pines would demonstrate how careless he could be. From the outset, he quite failed to make himself understood or obeyed. Longstreet was to command the troops of two other generals, Huger and Smith, who outranked him, a situation that Johnston never bothered to clarify in his orders. Furthermore, his orders to Huger and Smith were poorly drawn and incomplete. Those to Huger did not even state Johnston's intention to fight a battle on May 31st, leaving Huger in bewilderment. For Longstreet, his chief subordinate in the operation, Johnston wrote nothing at all. He gave him instead verbal orders during a long private meeting at the Strubbs house on the afternoon of May 30th. There is no record of the conversation. All that can be said of it for certain is that it produced a monumental misunderstanding of how the battle was to be fought. With everything set up for a disaster, on May 31st, Johnston would execute his plan, which instantly went awry. Longstreet had advanced up the wrong road, following up behind D.H. Hill's division along Williamsburg Road. This left the Confederate left exposed, forcing Johnston to send Whiting's division down to cover the Confederate left along 9 Mile Road. All the while, Huger, not even knowing he should attack, took his time moving down Charles City Road, and would completely miss the fighting on May 31st. However, during all of this madness, near the end of the fighting on the 31st, Joe Johnston was severely wounded, having to be taken from the field. In the end, Johnston's plan to assault the Union forces at Seven Pines turned into an unmitigated disaster, which was in no small part down to Johnston's planning and execution of the battle. Johnston's failings as a commander were made all the more apparent when Lee, who was given command of the Army of Northern Virginia after Johnston's wounding, would end up executing his own counteroffensive, which reversed the situation of the Confederacy by driving the Army of the Potomac away from the gates of Richmond and bottling them up at Osborne's Landing by July 2nd, 1862. Johnston's issues can best be summarized with two distinct problems. The first problem with Johnston's generalship was his inability to launch offensive assaults that worked. Seven Pines was not an anomaly, as Johnston would go on to do the same thing in 1865 at the Battle of Bentonville, concocting a complex plan requiring multiple sections of his army to arrive at the same time to work. This seldom happened in linear Napoleonic warfare, as conducting offensives without line of sight of other units was complicated and relied heavily on good coordination from capable subordinates. Lee was able to circumvent many of these issues by giving expressed orders, but allowing for his commanders to have enough wiggle room to make intuitive decisions when in combat. This can best be seen with General Order No. 75, which outlined Lee's plans for what would become the 7 Days Battles, which gave each wing of the army its specific tasks while also enabling them to conduct their actions as they best saw fit. The second issue with Johnston stems from his overall behavior as a commander. Johnston was extremely cautious, to a fault. His main propensity when seeing the enemy was to shout, "Retreat!" and withdraw from advantageous defensive positions. We see this during the Peninsula campaign, during the Battle of Williamsburg, where Longstreet managed to hold off the Army of the Potomac using the defensive works there, but Johnston still insisted on withdrawing from that position. This would again be replicated throughout the entirety of Johnston's command of the Army of Tennessee during the Atlanta campaign. Johnston, whenever confronted by the Army of the Tennessee, opted to consistently withdraw until he was removed from command, and John Bell Hood replaced him, leaving Hood with the empty sack that was the Army of Tennessee. Johnston's entire behavior as commander was a constant series of withdrawals and retreats. many of which were unnecessary, that often let the enemy have vital locations necessary for the Confederate war effort. As I've stated in Part 1, many of these dots on a map were of vital importance for the Confederacy for one reason or another, which makes Johnston's unwillingness to actually defend those areas all the more baffling. As my friend Blue and Butternut would put it, Johnston would have retreated to Cuba if given the chance. Add on top of this Johnston's unwillingness to even tell those that need to know his plans what he is planning, and you have a recipe for disaster. This is made all the more ironic when you consider Johnston's thoughts on Lee and Jackson in the post-war years, specifically within his book, Narrative of Military Operations Described During the Late War. Some of the criticisms he levels against Lee involve him pointing the finger at Lee for not sending troops to Vicksburg to help relieve Pemberton, even though, at the same time, Johnston had his own army, which was significantly closer to Vicksburg, and also had cavalry contingents, including the cavalry he took from Pemberton, that could have done the same thing. All Johnston needed to do was give Forrest the word.
Now go do that voodoo that you do so well.
In the end, Atun Shei is dead wrong about Johnston. Johnston was no brilliant military strategist as he, or anyone else, might claim. Not even many of the dedicated campaign historians consider him to be such. Rather, Johnston was a commander who constantly retreated, even when he could have defended until forced to attack, often managing to bungle those assaults and produce just as grievous casualties as Lee, but with little to no gain. From this point, Atun Shei goes on to mention a general that has become commonly mentioned online and is not at all unknown as many claim him to be. That man, of course, is General George Thomas. Atun Shei has the following to say about George Thomas in his video.
Look no further than George Henry Thomas, the Virginian Unionist. Like Meade, he was deliberate and never imperiled the lives of his men unnecessarily. But unlike Meade, he was creative. He was adaptable. He could always shift his strategy in the chaotic and ever-changing circumstances of warfare.
George Thomas, it is strange. I really haven't heard much about this faithless Virginian.
Well, that's because he was modest to a fault. In fact, he probably wouldn't want me to even mention him in this video, because he never wrote a memoir, and he even destroyed his wartime correspondences because he couldn't stand the idea of future generations picking over the events of his life. He also faced a lot of discrimination from his northern superiors because of his southern origins, and he was often overlooked for promotions and acclamations.
Typical.
I'm with you there. And ever since, General Thomas has been kind of forgotten about by historians, despite the fact that he was a huge badass. In a skirmish before the First Battle of Bull Run, he actually went toe-to-toe with Stonewall Jackson and kicked his fucking ass. At the disastrous battle at Chickamauga, when William Rosecrans, the Union Army commander, fled the field, Thomas remained behind, fighting on alone with his men against the whole Reb army, badly outnumbered and outflanked, and this holding action single-handedly saved the Army of the Cumberland from complete destruction. And 2 months later, United States forces would get their revenge at the Battle of Missionary Ridge, where Thomas and William Tecumseh Sherman orchestrated a frontal attack on the Confederate center that shattered their lines, and those lines, might I add, were entrenched on high ground. And then, in December 1864, Thomas faced off against John Bell Hood, who sucks, by the way, in the Battle of Nashville, and destroyed his army. That's not hyperbole. He literally destroyed it. The Army of the Tennessee was laid low, its ruin smote upon the mountainside. There would be no more large-scale fighting west of the Appalachians for the remainder of the war. George Thomas never lost a movement or a battle, and may very well have been the best general on either side in the entire conflict.
For this section, we'll be covering everything in order of how he presented them. First, he presents the notion that George Thomas destroyed his wartime correspondence upon his death, which isn't true. What was destroyed was his personal letters, especially those to his wife. His war correspondence were kept on file for the rather obvious reason that they would be needed for future generations to study what happened at particular battles. However, it is true that George Thomas did not write a memoir after the war, unlike some of his contemporaries like Sherman or Grant. He did this specifically because he wanted to avoid being involved in the politics of the time, as such memoirs were used to accuse others of misdeeds and so on. In fact, according to the 1911 issue of Encyclopedia Britannica, George Henry Thomas died while he was writing a response specifically concerning criticisms of his actions during the war on March 28, 1870. So, no, we know what he did during the war, but, much like with John Sedgwick, who died during the war at Spotsylvania Courthouse, we don't know too much about his personal life and personal letters. Second, Atun Shei makes a reference to a battle in 1861, claiming that George Thomas had defeated Thomas J. Jackson. At first, I wasn't even sure what he was referring to, but I did find out what battle he was referencing: the Battle of Hoke's Run. The issue with Atun Shei's claim is that Hoke's Run was not George Thomas kicking Jackson's rear, but rather Jackson conducting a rearguard action at Hoke's Run to delay the forces of General Robert Patterson, who had under his command 2 brigades led by Colonel John J. Abercrombie and then Colonel George Henry Thomas. Patterson's forces outnumbered Jackson's forces by 2-1. Jackson had fulfilled his task of delaying the Federal forces and subsequently withdrew from the field. This is by no means Thomas crushing or kicking Jackson's rear, as Atun Shei infers. Third, he mentions the Battle of Chickamauga, which he does get correct, for the most part. George Henry Thomas did, in fact, remain where he was and hold off the Confederate assault. But it's worth noting that he didn't do this alone either. The Reserve Corps, under the command of Gordon Granger, provided assistance to Thomas's holding maneuver at Snodgrass Hill. This was Thomas's defining moment in his military career and worth noting as an achievement of his generalship. Fourth, the Battle of Missionary Ridge was not as elegant as he put it. On the 24th and 25th, Sherman did the metaphorical equivalent of banging his head against a wall, bloodying up his own forces to the point that his forces are counterattacked by Confederate forces under the command of General Patrick Cleburne. What inevitably breaks the Confederate defensive line along Missionary Ridge was an assault from 3 sides of the ridge, with a combined force of over 56,000 men that forced the Confederates to withdraw from their defensive positions. Even with the victory, the casualties for the Union totaled roughly 6,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. This point also proves to be rather ironic, as Atun Shei constantly talks about how Lee was fond of his suicidal frontal assaults, and here, at Missionary Ridge, we have exactly that taking place with just as grievous casualties for the Union. Yet, in this case, it's supposed to be a brilliant stroke of military genius. It's rather ironic, to say the least. Fifth, and finally, George Thomas acted mainly in the defensive during the Nashville campaign. Was he able to severely maul the Army of Tennessee? Yes. Yet the Army of Tennessee managed to escape from the failed Nashville campaign and link up with Joe Johnston's forces by early 1865, bolstering the Army of the South with 15,000 additional men. It's also worth noting that this flight from Tennessee was facilitated by Nathan Bedford Forrest. In the end, I do consider George Henry Thomas to be a good general. But is he truly the best commander of the war? No. Rather, what I see in George Henry Thomas is James Longstreet. Thomas is great on the defensive, but lacking considerably in the offensive, often having poor coordination with the wings of his forces under his command and often failing to seize the initiative when the opportunity arises. I dare say that the best way to describe George Henry Thomas is that he is James Longstreet, but in a blue unit form. In a sense, I agree with Johnny Rep's sentiment upon hearing Atun Shei's shilling for George Henry Thomas.
Lord almighty, what else this fella do? Cure cancer?
On one final note, I want to address his sneering remark towards John Bell Hood. It has come to my attention that Hood's career as a military general has been increasingly slandered by only focusing on the Nashville campaign and his role as an army general. What's often forgotten about was his leadership skills while as a divisional commander in the Army of Northern Virginia. In that role, Hood showed a sense of aggressiveness, but, more importantly, had a strong sense of intuition and a capability to see advantageous positions during a battle. For instance, at Gaines' Mill in 2nd Manassas, his Texas Brigade performed excellently against the Union forces, forcing them to rout and acting as a hammer that broke the Federal defenses in both cases. At Gettysburg, he correctly wanted to advance around the Federal positions at Little Round Top and attack from the rear, which would have likely driven the Federals from the key defensive position. James Longstreet refused, adhering to Lee's orders, though it would be doubtful that Lee would have kept those orders due to the unsuitable nature of the terrain towards their front. By the time he took command of the Army of Tennessee, Hood had been wounded numerous times, which, more likely than not, affected his ability to command the army. Couple this with the position he was left in by Joseph Johnston, and the amount of criticism Hood receives becomes less and less warranted. To put it simply, Hood is not the incompetent commander that has become the zeitgeist of amateurish Civil War discussions. From here, we go on to witness, well, I'll let you watch and you make the decision for yourself.
Though as far as good Union generals go, there's one person that we haven't talked about yet.
Let me guess. Sherman. Do it again, Uncle Billy. Spare me your memes, sir. Besides, we've already done an entire episode about him.
No. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. Sherman is but the apprentice. He is the master.
Sir, lords of this date propose an armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation is just received. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately.
Johnny! Hey! Are you alright? We were talking, you just started screaming. Are you alright?
Yes, I'm fine. Just a minor hallucination.
It's moments like this that make me ask myself, what sort of drugs is he on? This is somehow supposed to be entertaining. This seems to be a prolific problem with his content, which has been partially responsible for my own deteriorating sanity. Deep into the darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Betsy! Ha!" Oh, I must have been going mad again. For a second there, I thought I was actually enjoying his content. No, no, no. It must be the fact I've seen too much of this. Let me move on from this abyss and discuss the true intention behind this again. He goes on to discuss the following.
Anyway, about Ulysses S. Grant, I mean, he was just a beast. I mean, that's the man who saved the Union.
Oh, so now Grant wasn't a drunk and didn't run up a horrific casualty rate amongst his troops. Forget the lost cause. All currently revisionist history has done to canonize the North and demonize the South.
Well, that depends on what you mean by a drunk. I mean, he definitely abused alcohol, but whether he was a occasional binge drinker or you want some? Or a full-fledged alcoholic, I mean, that's kind of hard to determine.
Well, no. Grant wasn't a drunkard during the war, but he did have prolific alcohol abuse prior to the war. There's little question about that fact. However, it's worth noting that Grant's accusation of being a butcher is not a post-war fabrication either. This was a title he earned after the Overland Campaign, due to the egregiously high casualties the Army of the Potomac suffered during the campaign, which also carried over to the Siege of Petersburg and after the Battle of the Crater. However, I'm curious about what Atun Shei is going to say about this, so for your sake, as well as mine, I'll let him speak.
If the Butcher Grant is the best you Yankees have to offer, then I'm afraid you are in a heap of trouble. For there is simply no comparison betwixt the Butcher Grant and old Moss Robert E. Lee. In the words of Jubal Early,
shall I compare General Lee to his successful antagonist? May as well compare the Great Pyramid, which rears its majestic proportions in the valley of the Nile, to a pygmy perched atop Mount Atlas.
Nice one, Jubal. Wonderful use of very specific North African imagery. You really showed that Butcher Grant what's what.
You keep calling Grant a butcher. Why is that?
Because his generalship contained no spark of military genius. His idea of war was to the last degree rude. No strategy, the mere application of the wing's inertia. He had none of that quick perception of the field of action which decides it by sudden strokes. He had no conception of war beyond the momentum of numbers. Such was the man who marshaled all the material resources of the North to crush the little army and overcome the consummate skill of General Lee.
That's a very common and especially Eastern theater-centric misconception, and it mainly stems from Grant's battles against Lee in 1864, namely the Overland Campaign. And yes, to be fair, the casualties in that campaign were appallingly high on both sides.
And though y'all eventually won, your casualties were higher than ours. We lost approximately 33,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Y'all lost 55,000 men killed, wounded, or missing.
Well, we were on the offensive during the Overland Campaign, and attackers do tend to take more casualties than defenders, especially since the war was becoming steadily more brutal, as tactics slowly transitioned between Napoleonic-style open-field-type warfare and kind of proto-World War I, deeply entrenched warfare of attrition. That was not the sort of campaign that Grant was trying to fight, by the way. He actually wanted to maneuver Lee into fighting an old-fashioned open-field type of battle, where he could bring his superior numbers to bear more effectively. But it was Lee who decided to entrench, so he could better protect Richmond and Petersburg. It had been something he had been threatening to do for a very long time. But Grant was grimly determined and kept the pressure up until the United States achieved a costly but decisive victory.
But what about the Yankee defeat at Cold Harbor, or the Turkish shoot slaughter at the Battle of the Crater?
Yeah, I mean, those two failed attacks were huge mistakes and resulted in a horrendous and completely unnecessary loss of life. But it's important to understand that those missteps were the exception of Grant's generalship, not the norm. You see, Grant had a truly national view of the conflict. Now, there's no way to say this without coming across at least a little bit cold-blooded, but it's a tragic fact. The carnage of the Overland Campaign was necessary to bring the war to a timely conclusion, which Grant did after less than a year in overall command of the United States forces. Contrast that with his predecessors in the East like McClellan or Burnside, who racked up significantly higher casualties than Grant did, with significantly less to show for it.
There's an issue that Atun Shei is ignoring here. Grant failed to achieve his main goals during the Overland Campaign, which he only briefly mentions. Grant wanted to defeat Lee in a pitched battle, which he failed to do. Additionally, he failed to advance towards Richmond, which was the main goal of the Overland Campaign. Instead of getting one or the other, Grant received neither. In fact, Lee was the one who was consistently playing Grant like a fiddle. For example, at the Battle of the Wilderness, Grant took the route he did based on the presumption that Lee would not attack him near Chancellorsville, only for Lee to do exactly that, forcing Grant on the back foot. When that battle turned into a bloody draw, Grant tried to move south again, only to be met with Lee already digging defensive positions near Spotsylvania Courthouse. It is at that battle that John Sedgwick was killed. There, Grant would suffer over 17,000 casualties compared to Lee's roughly 10 to 12,000 casualties, most occurring from the fighting over the Mule Shoe. After this, Grant tried to march around Lee again, only to meet Lee once again standing directly between him and Richmond along the North Anna River. Finally, Grant would try one last time to march around Lee, only for Lee to beat him to the crossroads at Cold Harbor, where Grant would suffer even more egregious casualties during the assaults on June 3, 1864, losing over 7,000 men over the course of a few hours. No matter what Grant did, Lee would, in some fashion or form, outdo him.
Sir?
The entire reason why Grant earned the derogatory name the Butcher stemmed from the Overland Campaign, when northern newspapers began to apply it to him and the disastrous toll the campaign took upon the Army of the Potomac. This notion would live on after the war, especially after Grant entered into politics and became President of the United States. This, in of itself, isn't a lost cause myth, but one that came from the Northern public criticizing Grant's actions during the Overland Campaign, which would go on to haunt him for the rest of his life. From here, Atun Shei continues on with his points, stating the following.
Grant and Lincoln had a very specific strategy in Virginia at the end of the war, to grab Lee by the neck, and to squeeze, and to keep squeezing, never giving him a moment's repose, never allowing him for a second to even think about going on the offensive.
Mr. President, if we are to draw troops from the field, it will prove difficult to suppress the rebellion in the disloyal states. My withdrawal now from the James River would ensure the defeat of Sherman.
General Grant, I have seen your dispatch expressing your unwillingness to break your hold where you are. Neither am I willing. Hold on with a bulldog grip and chew and choke as much as possible.
And as battered as Grant's army was, Lee's had suffered far worse, losing a full half of its combat strength in the Overland Campaign alone. And while the United States could always augment its forces with fresh troops, the Confederate States were running out of options. As Grant himself reflected,
The rebels have now in their ranks their last man. The little boys and old men are guarding prisoners, guarding railroad bridges, and forming a good number of their garrisons for entrenched positions. A man lost by them cannot be replaced. They have robbed the cradle and the grave equally to get their present force. Besides what they lose in frequent battles and skirmishes, they are now losing from desertions and other causes at least one regiment per day.
Sounds an awful lot like what I was just saying about overwhelming us with numbers.
Lee wasn't overwhelmed. He was outgeneraled. The Union had learned from experience that superior numbers and resources don't win wars on their own. So what they needed was a general who could effectively utilize those numbers and resources, which is exactly what Grant did. He pinned the Army of Northern Virginia down in Richmond and Petersburg while Sherman ravaged the Deep South and closed Lee's back door. Joe Johnston and P.T. Beauregard, who were at that time defending Georgia and the Carolinas respectively, did all they could to keep that trap from swinging shut, but Lee, meanwhile, just froze. He stayed put, and he allowed himself to be obliterated.
This is a contradictory statement to make. Lee was outgeneraled because he was overwhelmed? This sounds more like he's coming up with ways to downplay Lee's tactical capabilities throughout the war, rather than being genuine with his arguments. How could someone come up with such a contradictory belief and spout it without realizing its contradictory nature? Well, this is fairly simple to explain. Recall back in part 1 how I mentioned that Atun Shei has his main source he draws upon when making these videos, and will simply regurgitate them without hesitation. All of the previous arguments concerning Grant's leadership capabilities come from Edward Howard Bonekemper's book, Ulysses S. Grant, A Victor, Not a Butcher. This book can best be described as Grant simping, as the entire basis behind it is to portray Grant as a near-perfect person whom Lee should have given up and surrendered to after the Overland Campaign. The book is exceptionally biased towards Grant and exceptionally uncharitable towards Lee and his situation in 1864. This is why I've taken the time to look at a couple of different campaign books in order to best give my reasoning for why I hold the opinions I do. I wanted to point this out because Atun Shei does not do this when looking into these general works. In most of his sources referenced in the video, he almost never reads any books regarding the campaigns, nor goes into detail about them. Then again, he probably despises studying those things, as he views anyone who analyzes these things with contempt. To refer back to his video on Black Confederates,
You know, Johnny, it's really amazing. You're so knowledgeable about the Civil War. I ought to be. I fought in it. You and your fellow Lost Causers could rattle off the entire order of battle at Lookout Mountain by heart. You could tell me exactly how to hook up the shoulder boards on a general's frock. You know the number of mini balls that can fit into a standard issue cartridge box. So it's shocking how unbelievably ignorant you are of all of Southern history outside of those 4 little years of rebellion.
all I have to say is this. Atun Shei, if you actually bother studying these details, you might come to learn something about the war. But I doubt he'll ever do this and choose to slink back towards his preferred topic of injecting his politics into everything. However, to get back to Grant, I'm not here to say Grant is a terrible general. Not at all. Grant was a capable general who, if nothing else, managed to fix the Army of the Potomac's main underlying flaw that prevented it from being a true war-winning army: politics. In order to understand this, we need to refer back to the Gates of Richmond, as it includes several points regarding the political state of the army. In early March 1862, McClellan was planning for his grand offensive towards Richmond, which was largely pressured by Lincoln. On page 8, Sears says the following in regards to the planning of what would become the Peninsula Campaign. At the appointed hour on Saturday, March 8th, the 12 generals once again assembled at the White House. The president told them he was giving his approval to General McClellan's Urbana plan, and how greatly relieved he was to see the campaign at last going forward. He urged us all to go in heartily for this plan, Heintzelman noted in his diary. The point of this call for unity was soon evident, for Lincoln then announced the corps commanders for the field army, chosen according to seniority of rank. Of the 4 generals he named, Sumner, McDowell, Heintzelman, and Keyes, only Keyes was on record as favoring the Urbana movement. A 5th Corps under Nathaniel P. Banks would remain behind as a guarding force. There were some blank faces, as I am confident some of the others expected a place, Heintzelman remarked. Lincoln went on to list certain qualifications to his approval. No more than 2 corps were to sail from Annapolis until the Potomac was cleared of the enemy batteries. The capital must be left entirely secure, with its defenders determined jointly by McClellan and the new corps commanders. Finally, there was to be no further delay. The movement must begin by March 18th, 10 days hence. These instructions would be incorporated in presidential war orders, he said, and with that he adjourned the Council of War and sent the generals back to their commands. Later, Lincoln would dip his finger into the proverbial military pot once again when he withheld Irving McDowell's corps of the Army from reinforcing McClellan's advance onto Richmond. On page 111 to 112, Sears states the following. In due course, the President too came to see the purpose behind Jackson's offensive, especially after Banks was able to get his battered force to safety across the Potomac, and the alarm in Washington began to subside. Yet, the question of what to do next about the situation in the Shenandoah Valley found Lincoln and McClellan in fundamental disagreement. McClellan clung to his argument that the best defense for Washington, and for the Valley, was his armies moving against Richmond with every available soldier. The rebels would soon enough be obliged to recall Jackson to help defend their capital, and his threat would evaporate. The President, on the other hand, saw in Jackson's foray north all the way to the Potomac an opportunity for a counterstroke. If McDowell and Fremont moved swiftly, he said, they had the opportunity to trap and crush Jackson before he could escape from the valley, which event ought substantially to ease General McClellan's burden on the peninsula. Mr. Lincoln liked to remind the general that every rebel soldier not at Richmond was one less soldier he had to fight, and the President preferred throwing McDowell against Jackson in the valley immediately rather than see the two meet at Richmond at some future time. Further to the argument, he felt that McDowell and Fremont would give battle in short order. He was less confident that General McClellan, on his record and regardless of how many men he had, would fight any time soon. In issuing his orders, Lincoln told McDowell that everything depended upon the celerity and vigor of your movement. To Fremont, he telegraphed, "Put the utmost speed into it. Do not lose a minute." The constant meddling in the affairs of the Army of the Potomac was a part of the reason for the failures of the Army during the early war. Had McClellan got his way, McDowell's corps would have blocked Jackson's route back to Richmond via the Virginia Central Railroad, and surrounded Richmond from two sides. However, Lincoln's insistence of playing his own version of generalship left the flank open, leaving the 5th Corps as the only Union Corps north of the Chickahominy, opening the door for General Lee to attack the flank in late June 1862. This meddling reminds me of the Soviet Union during the Second World War, known as the Great Patriotic War in Russia. Joseph Stalin had a similar habit of playing armchair general during the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa, forcing his now weakened military structure to cater to his demands. This did not end well for the Soviets, and Stalin eventually stepped away from acting as general and let his professional generals, such as Grigory Zhukov, conduct the war. When politicians with little military experience make military decisions, it does not end up going well for the Army. However, this was only one of the aspects of how Army politics messed with the Army. Another aspect that affected the Army greatly were political appointees, such as Benjamin Butler, with his burger-binging ways, or Dan Sickles. However, one of the best examples of how this bureaucratic structure and constant infighting played out in the Army of the Potomac can best be seen in a microcosm. For this, we'll be looking into our 4th book of reference. The Petersburg Campaign, The Battle of the Crater, The Horrid Pit, by Michael A. Cavanaugh and William Marvel. In it, we get an interesting insight to how absolutely broken the Army of the Potomac was, even after Grant took command, and see the sheer level of incompetence that was allowed to ascend the ranks of the army. In the lead-up to the Battle of the Crater, there was considerable controversy involving the use of the United States colored troops to lead the assault against the defensive works at Elliott's Salient, after the mine, which had been completed and made ready, would detonate. On pages 21 and 22, Marvel et al. State, Burnside recited his last conversation with Meade for these two, and for Ledlie, when he finally arrived, describing the great anxiety it had caused him. He expressed a guarded hope that his plan had survived Grant's scrutiny intact. No sooner did he utter that sentence that Meade himself knocked on the tent pole. Burnside invited him in, and he entered with several other officers. Meade said that Grant had agreed the black troops should not lead the charge, not only because they were untried, but also because a failure that resulted in their slaughter would have disastrous political ramifications. Meade did not, however, tell Burnside that this second argument was something he himself had thrown against the plan when he presented it to General Grant. In fact, Meade appears never to have shown Grant Burnside's plan at all, but only the orders Meade had drawn up for his own modification of that plan. Burnside asked, one last time, if Meade would reconsider. "No, General," Meade replied. "The order is final." With a sigh, rising from despair, Burnside said he would do his best. Meade and his entourage departed, and the four remaining generals began wrangling over who ought to lead the assault. With his entire battle plan ruined, Burnside then struggled to figure out what to do from there. In the spur of the moment, he decided to have his 3 divisional commanders in charge of the regular troops draw lots. Unfortunately for everyone in the Union Army, Brigadier General James Ledlie ended up drawing the odd lot out. The book continues from page 22, stating, whether the individual division commanders lobbied for or against their respective commands is not recorded, but they covered a number of liabilities. Both Potter's and Wilcox's divisions had been roughly handled during the initial fighting, and for most of the time since had occupied the front line. Their men were sorely stressed and fewer in number than Ledlie's. On the other hand, Ledlie's division was in little better morale and was not so near the point of assault. Several hours would be required to put it in position. No one mentioned that Ledlie's division had made a botch of its attack on June 17th, and that many officers in his own command blamed Ledlie's incompetence, cowardice, or drunkenness for the failure. Most likely, Ledlie's incapacity was not the matter of general discussion it later became. Otherwise, Burnside would not have allowed what finally happened. When the battle began, Ledlie would slink away, pretending he had suffered some injury, and hide in a bomb-proof while he downed a bottle of whiskey. A drink that 4th Divisional Commander Edward Ferrero would also partake in, as the colored troops under his command had been excluded from initially engaging. The battle ended up being a wildly successful victory for the Army of Northern Virginia, as the Union suffered egregious casualties, which prompted an inquiry after the fact. In the end, Marvel and Cavanaugh provide their own thoughts on the matter, stating the following on page 116. If the choice of Ledlie resulted in disaster, the search for ultimate blame degenerates into a philosophical analysis of casualty. The Corps commander chose him by trusting luck. Ambrose Burnside had always been a gambler, at cards, in business, and on the battlefield, and except for the Battle of Fredericksburg, his luck had been very good during this war, so Burnside can be held to account for his gambler's instinct. The same logic carries on to Meade, whose interference with Burnside's original plan made necessary the choice that put Ledley's division in front. Had Meade only allowed his subordinate to carry out his initial scheme, all might have been well. The insanity of the planning and execution of the Battle of the Crater is a golden example of how bad the internal politics of the Army truly was. The main reason why the Army of the Potomac ended up becoming an effective army at all comes down to Grant and his ultimate decision-making. Though Grant made mistakes as commander of the armies in the theater, he learned from his mistakes and adapted his strategy given the circumstances. He might not have completely eradicated the issues within the Army of the Potomac, but he helped improve the internal issues to make the Army function while leading it to eventual victory. Grant is a solid general and a good leader. But is he better than Lee? Based on Atun Shei's argument, it would be a definitive yes. However, based on what happened during these campaigns, I would argue the answer is simply no. From this point, he discusses a portion we've addressed in Part 1, which then leads on to an argument concerning Lee and the Siege of Vicksburg. He goes on to state the following.
But for most of the war, Lee's entire mandate was his beloved Virginia. He wasn't even appointed General-in-Chief of all Confederate armies until February of '65.
Maybe not officially, but Lee was massively influential in the Confederacy and had been since 1862. And, he was the face of the rebellion. Lee was myopic about defending his home state, and multiple times, when key positions in the Western Theater were under dire threat, he flat out refused to send any of his troops to help. In mid-1863, when Grant was tightening the noose around Vicksburg and the rebel army ensconced there, Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon urged Lee to send George Pickett's division west. Lee responded with a refusal, of course, and it was full of excuses, some reasonable, others bizarre.
The adoption of your proposition is hazardous, and it becomes a question between Virginia and the Mississippi. The distance and uncertainty of the employment of the troops are unfavorable. If you determine to send Pickett's division to General Pemberton, I presume it will not reach him until the last of this month. If anything is done in that quarter, it will be over in that time, as the climate in June will force the enemy to retire. I think troops ordered from Virginia to the Mississippi this season would be greatly endangered by the climate.
And the one time Lee did acquiesce to reinforcing the West, when he sent Longstreet's corps to North Georgia, it made a key difference in defeating the U.S. Army at Chickamauga.
First, why is it up to Lee to send troops to aid Pemberton? After all, Joe Johnston had taken Pemberton's cavalry and kept it to himself, rather than relinquishing it to aid Pemberton. Again, all Joe Johnston had to do was give Forrest the word, and they'd be on their way to aid Pemberton. Yet he kept them for himself, even though he was significantly closer to Pemberton than Lee. Second, this letter comes on May 10th, only days after the Battle of Chancellorsville, on the same day of Thomas J. Jackson's death. The Army of the Potomac was still at large, and, though mauled, would still pose a threat that couldn't be overlooked. Third, and finally, sending one division to aid in breaking a siege is simply not enough. If he wanted to make a difference, he would have needed to send a corps of his army down to deal with the matter, which he could not do at the time with the Army of the Potomac still at large. The reason why he was able to send Longstreet's corps to help Bragg at the Battle of Chickamauga stemmed from the fact that the Army of the Potomac was neutralized as a threat for the rest of 1863, after having been horribly battered at Gettysburg. In the end, Lee couldn't do much about the situation at Vicksburg without placing Richmond, the area he was tasked to defend, under significant threat. However, what he could do was launch his own offensive to divert resources and men away from other theaters, which he did during the Gettysburg campaign. This is not evidence for Lee being a bad leader, but being practicable given the situation at hand. If anything, it's symptomatic of Joe Johnston being a poor leader. This leads us to a truly eyebrow-raising moment in the video. In it, he states the following.
In any event, Lee was right. He was handily outnumbered, and he hadn't a man to spare.
Well then, why did he always get them killed at such an astounding rate? If anybody deserves to be called a butcher, it's Bobby Lee.
Moss Robert? No. He loved us. He never threw our lives away needlessly.
Except he totally did. Like, all the time.
Nope. That's your boy Grant you're thinking of. He didn't care a whit about his men. He just threw waves of conscripted children to their deaths.
Let's crunch some numbers. Lee's greatest victory was the Battle of Chancellorsville. His army was about 60,000 strong and suffered nearly 13,000 casualties, a net loss of 22%. His opponent, Joe Hooker, had an army 133,000 strong and suffered about 17,000 casualties, a net loss of 12%. The victory, though tactically brilliant, gained no ground for the Confederacy, reaped no major strategic benefit, and resulted in the death of Stonewall Jackson, one of Lee's best generals. Grant's greatest victory was the Siege of Vicksburg. His army was 45,000 strong and suffered 3,000 casualties, a net loss of 7%. His opponent, John Pemberton, had an army about 40,000 strong and suffered 7,000 casualties dead, wounded, or missing, as well as a staggering 33,000 captured, a net loss of effectively 100%. The victory secured the Union's complete control of the Mississippi River and brought about the capture of the nearby state capital of Jackson. It ended rebel resistance in the region, exposed the Confederacy's soft underbelly of East Tennessee and Georgia, and was a crucial step toward final victory. Throughout the war, in the battles for which reliable statistics exist, Lee suffered an average killed or wounded casualty rate of 20.2%, and inflicted an average killed or wounded casualty rate of 15.4%. In total, 121,000 of the men under his command were killed and wounded, the highest of any general in the Civil War. Grant, on the other hand, suffered an average killed or wounded casualty rate of 18.1% and inflicted an average killed or wounded casualty rate of 20.7%. In total, 94,000 of the men under his command were killed and wounded, 23,000 in the Western Theater and 71,000 in the East.
These numbers and statistics are baffling, along with the claims made when presenting them. For this, we'll be breaking down the battles he lists and then discuss the overall issue with all of this. First, I addressed some of the claims concerning Chancellorsville in Part 1, specifically the claims of the lack of importance of the victory there. However, what I did not address was the numbers listed here. The numbers are largely correct, but it's worth noting here that Atun Shei is forgetting the rather obvious fact that Lee was heavily outnumbered by 2-1, which is why so many military historians focus as much as they do on the battle. Lee managed to defeat a significantly superior force with an inferior force and managed to force them to withdraw from the battlefield and back towards their positions near Washington, D.C., thwarting Joe Hooker's attempt to assault Richmond. Second, this particular statistic concerning the Vicksburg campaign conflicts with other sources regarding it. According to the American Battlefield Trust and Wikipedia article, which draw from Francis Kennedy's The Civil War Battlefield Guide, Grant had a force of over 77,000 men during the Siege of Vicksburg compared to Pemberton's 33,000 men, where Grant suffered roughly 4,900 casualties compared to Pemberton's 3,202 losses, excluding his surrender, of course. The reason for this bizarre discrepancy comes about because Atun Shei ended up forgetting to include casualty figures from several battles during the Siege of Vicksburg, something he openly admitted to. Yet, I'm not sure where he got the 7,000 casualty figure from concerning the Confederacy. If he's including actions prior to the Siege of Vicksburg, then why not include all of the previous examples such as Chickasaw Bayou, where William T. Sherman decided it was a brilliant idea to attack a Confederate position atop high ground through a swamp. This battle, if you didn't know, was a humiliating defeat for Sherman. After all, the Siege of Vicksburg was the culmination of multiple failed attempts to take the city since mid-1862. Third, and finally, he includes this comparison between Lee and Grant across their whole military careers. Yet, I find a serious issue with this. For one, it's not a fair comparison of Lee and Grant when both generals engaged one another. For this, we can take a quick comparison of the Overland Campaign and the Siege of Petersburg. Using the numbers made available on Wikipedia for both, we first look into the Overland Campaign. If we take the killed and wounded for the campaign, it turns out that the percentage value of casualties for Grant's overall command totaled to approximately 37%. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee's total killed and wounded figure is closer to 36.13%, based on a high estimate of 65,000 men for the Army of Northern Virginia. For context, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was roughly half the size of Grant's total command of 125,000 men. When we look into the Petersburg campaign, we cannot easily separate killed and wounded, meaning that the comparison is harder to make. However, during that campaign, Grant's command suffered a 33.6% casualty percentage compared to the Army's size, while Lee suffered 46.7% casualties overall, not including the desertion figures. Yet, it's worth noting that during all of this, Lee was consistently fighting at a numbers disadvantage throughout the war. At its maximum, the Army of Northern Virginia had a size of roughly 90,000 men. More often than not, the Army of Northern Virginia's size hovered around 55,000 to 60,000 men. Meanwhile, the Army of the Potomac had a maximum size of over 120,000 men, with it hovering around 105,000 men throughout most of its campaigns. Grant's command of the armies in the Virginia theater was no exception to this rule. This is where we confront the main problem with these percentage values. Percentages mean little without context provided behind them. To provide an example, during one engagement of the First Battle of Petersburg, the Confederates suffered over 60% casualties, while the Union forces suffered only 4% casualties. In the void, it sounds like the Confederates did a horrible job during the battle. But what if I told you that I'm referring to the Battle of Old Men and Young Boys? In the engagement, 125 militiamen from the city of Petersburg made a stand against a force consisting of over 1,300 cavalrymen under the command of Brigadier General August V. Krautz, delaying the cavalry until Henry Wise and Beauregard could bring up additional units to stop the Federal assaults. When we place this event into its appropriate context, we end up with a situation drastically different from the raw percentages, which, though technically correct, do not provide the whole picture. These sorts of figures provided by Atun Shei are heavily based on figures presented by Bonekemper and his work. It's worth noting here that Bonekemper, prior to his death in 2017, was noted as being an attorney for several federal government institutions. The manipulation of such information through the use of percentages is the manifestation of an old adage popularized by Mark Twain. There are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. Whenever people bring up statistical figures of this nature, never be afraid to question them and crunch the numbers yourself. Or, better yet, always do additional research on a topic before taking what someone online says about a topic at face value. From there, you will learn who you can trust and who cannot be trusted. From here, Atun Shei goes on to say the following concerning Lee.
Look, Lee was a good general. Sure. I venture to say he did a better job leading the Army of Northern Virginia than I would have done. I'm not trying to unduly demonize him here or exaggerate his faults, but a military genius? The greatest field commander in American history? No. That's a fairy tale, born from more than a century of creepy pseudo-religious deification. In many ways, the comparison between Grant and Lee tells us all we need to know about why the war went the way it did. Lee led with the power of personality. He thought that war should be grand, sweeping, and heroic. He loved dramatic charges and clever tactical sleights of hand. He considered logistics to be an annoyance rather than an opportunity, which is why Confederate military history is full of flashy daring-do, but pretty short on substantial operational success. Grant, meanwhile, was all stubbornness and pragmatism. War was not a game to him. There was nothing poetic about it. Like his buddy Sherman, he believed that to wage war meant to bring it to a favorable conclusion as quickly as possible. And to achieve victory, he used every tool available to him. Deception, diversion, maneuver, relentless attack, and dogged defense, and never lost sight of the big picture. Battles didn't really matter that much in of themselves. They were just stepping stones toward the distant goal of ultimate victory. And that's why, for the most part, the Confederacy did not have better generals. You were obsessing over tactics while we were planning strategies. You thought small, we thought big. That's why we won.
All of this is nothing more than empty conjecture. When we look at everything he has said up to this point in regards to the different generals, very little he has said can be supported by a solid understanding of the campaigns at hand. His points against Lee simply don't hold any water when we actually bother to take into account Lee's situation and what he was able to do, what his main goals were during the war. Yet what makes this entire statement odd is he insists he is not doing this to undermine Lee. But the entire video, up until this point, has been an attempt to undermine Lee as a general. It's inherently contradictory, as is his entire argumentation up to this point. The Union won by the numbers advantage, but no, actually, they won because they had better generals. This entire argument has been riddled with contradiction after contradiction, which is made self-evident when we simply look at the individual campaigns and see how well these commanders performed. Yet, Johnny Reb actually expresses a sentiment that's completely and utterly correct.
Look at you. Smugly conducting military campaigns 150 years after the fact from the comfort of your armchair.
Not only is Johnny Reb correct, he's dead on the money. Everything up to this point has been armchair generalship of the highest order. What Atun Shei, Bone Kemper, Joe Johnston, and Abraham Lincoln all have in common is their propensity to act as armchair generals, arguing how to best win the war while either not being in a position of these commanders or proving to be terrible commanders who failed where the men they criticized succeeded. Lee, Jackson, Hood, Burnside, McClellan, and so on weren't bad. Flawed? Yes, just as anyone is flawed. But none of them can be conclusively marked as terrible generals. Yet they get lumped into this category by people who think they know best when, in reality, they don't. None of them have any right to criticize these commanders when they cannot prove themselves to be any better. Yet, it only goes downhill from here. After stating that he was not trying to undermine Lee, he goes on to discuss the following concerning Lee.
Generalship aside, Lee was by far the better man. Look no further than how Grant and Lee treated their slaves. Grant kept his and said he not raise his sword to free any slave. Lee, on the other hand, freed his. He acquired them in marriage and treated them justly.
That's maybe like a quarter true. In the mid-1850s, Grant did manage about 30 enslaved people at his father-in-law's farm. By all accounts, he was a terrible slave driver because he was too gentle with them.
A woke slave driver is still a slave driver.
I couldn't agree more, and Grant was, briefly, a slaveholder himself. He owned a man named William Jones for about a year before freeing him in March of 1859.
Yes, Grant was a slave owner, and General Lee was, of course, an abolitionist.
No.
He called slavery a moral and political evil. I have a quote.
In this enlightened age, there are few, I believe, but what will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country.
Yeah, and in that same letter he also says,
The systematic and progressive efforts of abolitionists to interfere with and change the domestic institutions of the South are truthfully and faithfully expressed. The consequences of their plans and purposes are also clearly set forth, and they must also be aware that their object is both unlawful and entirely foreign to them, and can only be accomplished by them through the agency of a civil and servile war. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise and merciful providence.
If Lee believed slavery was an evil, he thought it was a necessary one. And actions speak louder than words, right? Hiring records show that Lee personally owned people until at least 1852, and frequently sold or traded them away at his own convenience, even though that meant breaking up their families. Evidence from his personal letters shows that when Lee did free his slaves, he didn't do it out of the kindness of his heart, but rather because he hated supervising them and didn't want them around. When he briefly managed his wife's slaves at their house in Arlington, he was a notoriously cruel slave master and drove his people hard. As late as July 1860, he considered buying even more slaves and rented out slaves as personal servants throughout the entire Civil War.
Well, it's not
I'm not done. Politically, Lee consistently supported pro-slavery policies, and after the war upheld laws specifically designed to restrict the rights of freedmen. He also frequently expressed racist views, which were certainly very much in keeping with his time, but are still a far cry from our popular image of the kindly General Lee. During his time in Mexico, he found the people of that country to be
weak, primitive in their habits and tastes.
He referred to Native Americans as
hideous, uninteresting.
And the only people he seemed to have any affection for at all were, predictably,
though climate, government, and circumstance have produced changes in the character of people, yet in all essential qualities they resemble the races from which they are sprung. And to no race are we indebted for the virtues and qualifications which constitute a great people than the Anglo-Saxon.
Your sainted Grant was no better. Did you know that he was a rabid anti-Semite? In December of 1862, a handful of businessmen, some of them Jewish, were illegally selling cotton in Grant's military district. So he issued General Orders Number 11, which expelled all Jewish people from the area under his military control. The order read,
The Jews, as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department, and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department.
Yeah, and the verbiage of the order reflects old European stereotypes about Jews too. So, a super bad look, and you will not find any argument from me. Unsurprisingly, or perhaps surprisingly, the order was met with general public outrage. Lincoln was horrified and immediately rescinded Grant's edict. And though the general insisted that it was all a big misunderstanding, the controversy would haunt him for the rest of his life. Especially during his presidential run, he issued multiple public apologies. Was he sincere? Who is to say? I mean, he was a politician after all. You know, Johnny, here's what I think it really comes down to as far as how we choose to remember these men. Here's what I think. Are you ready?
Spit it out.
Here's what I think. Ulysses S. Grant was instrumental in bringing about the end of slavery in this country. Bobby Lee tried his very best to keep the damn thing going.
What makes me sickened by all of this is how Atun Shei, without any second thoughts, openly and overtly contradicts himself. This entire section can only be described as character assassination of Robert E. Lee, particularly because of how he leaves out vital context concerning his time managing Arlington. For this, we will delve one final time into Douglas Southall Freeman's biography of Lee and go through this part of his life. On pages 92 and 93 of the abridged version, we can read the full letter written from Lee to his wife regarding this matter. In it, he states the following. In this enlightened age, there are few, I believe, but what will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country. It is useless to expatiate on its disadvantages. I think it, however, a greater evil to the white than to the black race, and while my feelings are strongly enlisted in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong for the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and fiscally. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise, merciful providence. Their emancipation will soon result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy. This influence, though slow, is sure. The doctrines and miracles of our Savior have required nearly 2,000 years to convert but a small part of the human race, and even among Christian nations, what gross errors still exist. While we see the course of the final abolition of human slavery is onward, and we give it the aid of our prayers and all justifiable means in our power, we must leave the progress as well as the result in the hands of who sees the end, who chooses to work by slow influences, and with whom 2,000 years are but a single day. Although the abolitionist must know this and must see that he has neither the right or power of operating except by moral means and situations, and if he means well to the slave, he must not create angry feelings in the master, that although he may not approve the mode by which it pleases Providence to accomplish its purposes, the results will nevertheless be the same, that the reason he gives for interference in what he has no concern holds good for every kind of interference with our neighbors when we disapprove of their conduct. Still, I fear he will persevere in his evil course. Is it not strange that the descendants of those pilgrim fathers who crossed the Atlantic to preserve their own freedom of opinion have always proved themselves intolerant of the spiritual liberty of others? Freeman makes it clear that the views expressed in the letter were commonplace among many of Lee's contemporaries of the time, that slavery, though an evil, is a necessary one for now, and that abolition was to occur gradually, not through the use of force and done all at once. In the end, there is no doubt that Lee did view slavery as something that was wrong and should come to an end, but not by forcing it. Roughly a year after writing this letter, Lee's father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis, would pass away in October 1857. Lee, who was executor of the will, ended up having to take extended leave in order to address the matters at hand in Arlington. When Lee returned home to Arlington, Freeman states the following. On November 11th, Lee reached Arlington on the saddest of all of his antebellum homecomings. The shadow of Mr. Custis's death still hung over the plantation. The absence of his father-in-law was less of a shock to Lee than the plight of his wife. When he had left home in 1856, she had been in her usual health, which had been fair after she had recovered from the pelvic infection which had caused her so much suffering in 1836. Lee had heard in January that she was ill, but he does not seem to have realized the seriousness of her condition. Arthritis had assailed her right hand and arm. Lee now found her scarcely able to move about the house, and, though she was only 49, aging very rapidly. Overnight, and without warning, he had to face the fact that his wife had become an invalid. Lee soon found that Mr. Custis's will had put a heavy burden on him. He had to discharge all the duties of settling a troublesome estate under a complicated testament. Mr. Custis had drawn up the paper in 1855, apparently without consulting counsel. He left Mrs. Lee a life interest in Arlington and its contents and in adjacent properties. On her demise, all this property, except the minor plate, was to pass in fee to Custis Lee, he, my eldest grandson, taking my name in arms. His White House plantation of 4,000 acres in New Kent County, Mr. Custis left to Rooney Lee, and the Romancock property of like acreage he bequeathed to his youngest grandson, Robert E. Lee, Jr. To Colonel Lee, he left a lot in Washington City. Each granddaughter was to receive $10,000. One paragraph of the will provided that Smith's Island, off Northampton County, and sundry lands in Stafford, Richmond, and Westmoreland counties should be sold to provide these legacies. Another section said that these properties and my estates of the White House in the county of New Kent and Romancock in the county of King William were to be charged with the payment of the legacies to my granddaughters. The will then read, Smith's Island and the aforesaid lands in Stafford, Richmond, and Westmoreland only are to be sold, the lands of the White House and Romancock to be worked to raise the aforesaid legacies to my 4 granddaughters. All the Custis slaves were to be emancipated, the said emancipation to be accomplished in not exceeding 5 years from the time of my decease. The courts manifestly would be required to construe this document and to determine the nature and extent of the liens on White House and Romancock. The beneficiaries under the will were of the same family. If, therefore, all went well and the miscellaneous landed properties yielded enough to pay the greater part of the legacies without draining the White House and Romancock for too long a time, the settlement would be a matter of no great difficulty. The immediate trouble was that Mr. Custis left more than $10,000 of debts and virtually no money with which to operate the estate. He had always been a negligent farmer and an easy-going master, and he had become more careless as he had grown older. His Arlington tract of 1,100 acres was sadly run down. Instead of inheriting easy luxury, the Lees found themselves land poor. The situation at Arlington was in such a bad state that Lee was forced to take multiple leaves of absence in order to get things organized at the plantation. All the while, his wife and daughters were suffering from bouts of illness, which only added to Lee's stress in 1858. The situation Lee found himself in was a situation that no one ever wants to find themselves in, having to take care of sickly family members, having to serve as executor of the will, and while having to pay the colossal debt burden your deceased father-in-law left for you to shoulder. This is why Lee tried to get a reinterpretation of the will done, and why he ended up renting off the slaves at Arlington during his time there. It was not out of some cruel sadism in his heart, but out of the simple fact of sheer necessity. If he was to execute the will and pay off the debt, he needed to make Arlington productive, and to do so within 5 years. So, when placing all of that into context, it becomes rather clear as to why Lee did what he did. It was not due to any hatred of the enslaved population. Rather, it was due to desperation in order to reverse a bad situation, all while contending with an ailing, distraught wife and 2 ill daughters. I bring all of this up for one simple reason. This has become a prolific point of attack against Lee's moral character, so commonly used by the likes of Atun Shei and other ideologically driven people. Instead of honestly analyzing Lee's military career, something Atun Shei doesn't even do, they have to resort to character assassination against Lee. Yet they always mask it behind the same tired excuse. To refer to Atun Shei's own remarks one final time.
Agree to disagree. We always get diverted into talking about race.
It's almost as if racism and the Civil War are pretty closely interrelated.
I must say, sir, I found your arguments thoroughly unconvincing, and if I may be so bold as to remark, even more biased than usual. You know, I really don't like it when you say those sorts of horrible things about General Lee.
Look, Johnny, I'm not trying to pick on you, all right? It's just that lost causers have been sucking Lee's dick for 140 years. It's like the longest blowjob in American history, and it's left a real stain on this country. I'm not trying to paint him as some horrible monster. I'm just course-correcting against generations of hero worship.
Character assassination is not course-correcting. It is defamation of character. It is this very lie that they always hide their true intentions behind. These people don't care about the historic record or presenting the true history. They never have and never will. Their true intention is the same as always, asserting their ideological beliefs as absolute fact by undermining and denigrating men who were, in every way conceivable, better men. It is the character assassination seen here, whether through manipulative videos like this video, through the works of Bone Kemper, or through the media and their manipulation of the facts, that we see the destruction of these great men and everything associated with them. As we see this year, not even Robert E. Lee's horse is safe from the iconoclasm of the postmodern revisionist. In conclusion, this video is one of the most manipulative videos he has ever produced. It includes just about every conceivable tactic in the book, from manipulative statistics and figures to outright character assassination. This is made all the worse when you consider the fact that this video is often cited as a source in virtually all online discussions concerning the actions of various generals during the war. It stands as a testament of how faulty historical presentation can so easily manipulate an audience, wholly ignorant on the subject, into believing things that simply make no sense when we look into these events with added context. So, I hope all of you have enjoyed this long-winded video. Please, after watching this, take the time to go outside and touch some grass, get a little fresh air, and enjoy the beauties of creation. I hope everyone who has made it through this has a wonderful day, and may God bless all of you.